So, the new Swords and Magic update came out recently, and there have been some things about Swords and Magic that have been kind of bugging me in the direction that's been going. And it's really been something that was amplified now with this new patch, and it's kind of just something that I wanted to get off my mind and talk about with you guys. And it's just a few problems with the progression curve that is going on with Swords and Magic right now, and the direction they're taking it. And this isn't me trying to, bash on the game or anything like that. Every game has problems. I love Swords and Magic. I wouldn't play it if I didn't, and I wouldn't follow it so hard and deeply if I didn't love it. So it's a great game, but every game has problems, and I just wanted to talk about those problems and kind of use it as a kind of learning experience for other game developers to see how to better improve your progression systems in games and how people should be going about progression in terms of RPG games like this, because I have done an extensive amount of research in my past about different progression curves and how they work in general, and how to balance games and how you should be balancing games. And this game, Swords and Magic, is a bit unique in that it doesn't really follow the norm, and there are some places where it probably should a little more. It should, learn from other games and their mistakes to see how to better improve theirs. And so I'll just be talking about a few of those now. Just a quick warning that there will probably be spoilers in the video, so if you don't want to see the spoilers, then probably don't watch. The first thing I really want to talk about is the progression curve or the power curve, and I'll use those interchangeably, power curve and progression curve. But I want to talk about it in terms of Swords and Magic and in terms of how it compares to other games like World of Warcraft or other RPG games. So, starting off with, what is a progression curve or a power curve? And if I just come here and I draw a nice chart for you guys, let me just do it up here a little more. It is your power over your time. And time, this is your position in the game. Are you, in a regular RPG, this would be what level you are. Are you level 10, 20, 30? Are you in early game or late game? For a game like Sword and Magic, this would be, are you on the tutorial island? Are you on the Jura island? Are you on the farmlands, Bone Reach, etc., etc.? Where are you in the game? For something like power, this is a little more subjective, a little interchangeable. This can be things such as the power of the player, the power of a weapon, the power of the enemy. It really depends on what you're looking at. So for the player, because this is what we care about mostly, this is the average of the gear that they own. So I have 2 iron axes, so I average them, the power of them out, and that would be my average power level. This could also apply though to if there are amulets in the game. Is there food in the game? What else is there in the game that can influence my power? I average that all together, and that's my power level. So for me, I take the average of the iron axes, and that's my power. For a new player, if they just have a wooden sword, their power level is going to be a lot less than mine because they have gear that has a lower power level. So for the power curve, this part here, let's look at gear then. Now, what defines what power level let's say a weapon is at, because Swords and Magic uses weapons as the main form of progression. So you can't just take a weapon and say, oh, its damage is its power. Now that is a huge factor in determining the power. In fact, for most weapons, that's mainly what you're going to use, is how much damage they do. But you can't just use that, otherwise you are going to get some really bad results. You also want to take things like, well, does it slow enemies? Does it cleave? Does it do, hit more than one enemy? Is it ranged? Things like that. All those things will make a weapon have a higher power or a lower power than other weapons. You know, for some things it could be, does it block? So is it a shield? Because that might change its power, even though shields don't do damage. They block, which gives them a certain power level, and etc, etc. Now in a game like World of Warcraft, power level is actually the same thing as item level. So if you played WoW, you know that they have item levels on all of their gear. It's the exact same thing. Item level, power level, same thing. They are interchangeable. Because they decided to put a number on it that you can view in game. So how should a power curve look? Well, it can be downward, it can be upward, it can be flat. Now, if it's downward, that's probably not going to be very fun. It can be balanced, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be as fun, because this means that the player is getting weaker over time as they play the game. You could probably make an interesting game with this, but probably not an RPG. So, how should it look then? Well, it should obviously be an upward curve, but it shouldn't be flat like this. It should be a parabola. It should look curved upward. And this is because you want the player to exponentially grow in power, because then they are having more fun, they are more motivated to push that extra hour, be like, oh, I'm going to grind for one more hour, you know, because I really want to get to that next point to where, because the next hour I play is going to be much stronger than the last hour I played. And maybe it seems bad, you know, trying to make your players push extra hours, you know, grind, but in reality that just means they're having fun in the end. So you want the player to have fun, right? So how do we use this curve to balance, let's say, enemies? Well, to balance enemies, it's really simple. All you do is you take the curve, so let's say this is the player's power curve, and then you take the enemy's power curve and you just try and match them. So there you go, and you use this curve as a kind of baseline for where should enemies be at any point in game. So if you are end game, enemies should be around here, and in early game, enemies should be around here. But let's say I want a boss enemy. I want an early game enemy that's a boss. He's harder to kill than normal. Well, all you do is you push him up above the curve. If you want mobs that are really easy to kill, like rats, and that can just die quickly, you put them below the curve. For endgame, you do the same thing. If I want endgame boss, all I do is put the boss above the curve. For mobs that maybe he summons, you put it below the curve. It's really that simple. Now, for something like weapons or gear that you want to balance, let's say I want a sword that drops early game. All I do is come over here and make sure to put it on top of the curve. So there you go, there's a weapon that drops early game. And if you do this with all your gear, then let's say the player is right here, since all the gear they're getting is on this curve, their average item level or their average power level is going to average out to where they should be on the curve. And that is how you create this curve, by taking the gear that they get, everything that they get, and putting it on this curve. Now you don't want to be taking gear and putting it ever above the curve or below the curve. You want it to be on the curve, because that will make the player's curve look like this. So if I have an endgame weapon, I put it on the curve, and now all the gear that they get will eventually be on this curve. So let's say I have a frost weapon now, an item that slows enemies. Now I could just, you know, give it damage. Like any weapon, I just apply damage to put it on the curve. So if I want it to be on this curve, I just say, oh, you're going to have 20 damage and X speed or whatever, and that will put you on the curve. But for an item that will also slow enemies, they have a starting point. So let's say all slowing weapons, I determine start there. Well, now if I were to just apply the same amount of damage, that weapon is going to be way above the curve. So I compensate and remove some damage to take that same weapon and move it down so that it's on top of the curve. And that's basically how you use this power curve in order to balance items and enemies. So I want to talk about the power curve in Swords and Magic and stuff, and kind of the problems that I noticed with it. So this is only up to Azura Island, because that's all that's released right now. And this starts from, but the thing is, every zone has an early game and end game. So there should be an early game and end game for Azura, for farmlands, for Bone Rage, for every area. There needs to be a beginning and an end, because that is how you balance a game. And so here we need to assume that, early game, this is things like what you get right off Tutorial Island. End game, this is stuff that you should be getting after hours of playing. Now this is every weapon in the game as of a few patches ago, because some of these numbers will be a little bit out of date because I haven't gotten around to updating the wiki, but the wiki is where I got all these numbers from. So some of them are a little outdated, but the overall standing of the numbers was the same. They didn't change by too much, and there's a couple weapons that are missing from this, so it's not everything. But I just really quick, so I put all the weapons based on where I got them in the game. So all these points over here to the left over here is all the weapons that you get in early game, like wooden gear and like sticks and stuff like that. Over here you have things like iron gear, things like that. I believe bone gear is right around here, and then over here we have all the end game stuff, things that you can only get through exploring, things like Azurian weapons and the frost weapons and things like that. So I also applied a quick curve for what the power level of everything is, and it's not exact because I didn't go into too much detail. I mainly used damage and whether it was single-handed, two-handed, and ranged to determine what the power is. I didn't go into too much details, mainly because that would be a bit of work, but you could, in theory, just go in depth and create a better curve. But the thing is, even with all that, damage still is the main factor in power, especially with a game like Swords and Magic, where there isn't any frost abilities, there isn't any burn abilities or anything like that, nothing that you can really apply to it. Most weapons are just damage right now. In the future it will change, obviously, because as more stuff gets added, things will get more complex, and that's just something that they have to account for. But for now, this is pretty accurate, very accurate actually. So now looking at this, it's really spread out in terms of the curve. It goes up and down because, like, just look at this. In fact, there are weapons over here which are weaker than weapons over here, and that's a little understandable. Some of it, like, there are a couple meme weapons like the golden stick that are meant to just be, sure, they are endgame gear, but they're meant to be joke weapons. They are not meant to be used in combat. They're just meant to be kind of funny. But that doesn't explain all of these. Like, a lot of these gears are way down here on the curve when they should be way stronger. And if you're wondering, actually, right here, this I believe is the Iron Mace, which is a one-handed mace that does quite a bit of damage. You apply two of those to a person, and that's probably about as strong as you can get. Stronger than somebody with an Azurian greatsword, because it's just way stronger. Now, this is actually the reason why I main hand iron axes. Even though I own a lot of legendary gear, I still use 2 iron axes as my main weapons because, well, for one, I don't have iron maces because I don't know where to get them anymore, but 2, because they are stronger than most other gear in the game. And this is something that should be balanced out a little better, because things that are harder to get should be stronger. But I can kind of understand why a game like Swords and Magic is so hard to balance, and why it's like kind of had trouble balancing. And that's part of a couple of the other points that I'll get to in the future, but for now, I will say I don't fully believe that Kindred Games is using a power curve. I'm not fully sure if they even know much about power curves, because it's not a bad thing, because I know there's a lot of game developers out there who don't know about how these power curves work. I'm kind of an outlier because I did college research on these things because it was something that interested me, and so that's the only reason I know. I wouldn't have known otherwise. So I do think that, you know, this curve should be a little more distributed like this, but I mean, it's not the worst balancing in the world, I would say, because it does still in general go up. There are some gear that should be higher up, and it probably has gone better over the couple patches. I just haven't gotten the stats or the numbers to verify it. But that is the main problem that I'm seeing now, is that in this direction they aren't really taking the numbers and balancing it accordingly. Alright, to end this part off, I would like to talk about kind of solutions that would work well with this. So if I were to just say, the solution is pretty simple. It's basically, what they should do is they should take what kind of power do they want weapons to have at the start of the game and what do they want at the end of the game. So let's say all weapons are going to have a damage level of 1 at the start of the game, and by the end game they should be around, let's say 50, something like that. Well, then they just make a curve and they go whoop like this, where this is 1, this is 50, and you know, power is an arbitrary number, so you could say that the power should just be damage, and then all you have to do is just say, okay, well, if you have a frost weapon, then even though it goes above the curve, if it had this right amount of damage, you just give it less damage to make it on the curve, and you just use it as your power curve essentially. And this is all they have to do really. And so for what they do for Azure Island is they say, okay, well, what is this number for Azura, which is probably around 10, I think maybe 12 is the max, and then they just build this curve around that, and this is essentially what it would be. But 12 is not a very good number to work with, and that is kind of what I want to talk about next, is kind of their damage range and what they are doing for their damage range, and kind of the reasons why it's not very good. So next I kind of want to talk about power or damage distribution. And so what is damage distribution? It's basically just, if I have at the start of the game my weapons do 1 damage, and at the end of the game my weapons do 100 damage, then my distribution is 100, or I guess technically 99, because it's the difference of the two, and that's your distribution. And while this is pretty important, because you know, the bigger the distribution, the more wiggle room you have, because if you remember, there's a curve here, and if I have a weapon that's up here and I want to push it down, the more distribution I have, that means the more wiggle room you have to play with to fine tune this point to get it as close to this line as it should be. And that's generally why games have a bigger number distribution in terms of their damage. And as well as that, like I said, because the curve needs to be exponential, higher numbers or higher distribution means that you can have more separation between this weapon and this weapon. If you have a low distribution, then it's very hard to get between those numbers. I'm not saying it's impossible, but in fact it actually 100% is possible, because if you have a scale of 1 to 10, then you just have to allow for decimal places, which is theoretically, it's great, because you know, if I want one weapon to be 2 damage and the next weapon to be the next upgrade to be 2.1, it's an upgrade, it works, but for 1, decimal places are ugly, and 2, that still doesn't feel very good for the player. You know, even though it might be a huge increase for the game you're playing, it would feel a lot better if you instead did 20 to 21 damage. And that means that you have to have a distribution of 1 to 100 instead of 1 to 10, because then you can have these fine-tuned numbers without it being ugly, while also making it feel a lot better. So for Swords and Magic's damage distribution, I have an example using these 4 daggers right here. They're all standard quality, and even though I'm missing a few, I just couldn't find them, or I just didn't have the time, but this is fine for now. If we just look, here we have the wooden dagger, very starter weapon that you get on the Shipwreck Island. Then you have the stone dagger, which is the next upgrade up. Then there's a huge upgrade when you get the Puck's dagger, and an even bigger upgrade when you get the Crescent dagger. And when I say a big upgrade, I mean that in terms of how hard they are to get. You know, this is really easy to get. You get it ready to start the game. This one's a bit harder. You just have to grind for it. This one you have to do a fairly big quest, medium-sized quest line, I should say, to do it, and it's not the worst thing in the world. But then this one, you have to. It's really hard to get because it's a hard quest to do. It's hard to figure out and put all the pieces together. So, you know, you would expect it to go along this curve. So you'd expect this to be way further along the curve than, say, these items. But if we look at the damage, they all have the same speed and crit with the exception of the Crescent dagger. But this one has a damage of 2, and we don't care about the minimum damage. Because of the nature of Swords and Magic, the minimum damage doesn't matter, because minimum damage changes based on your level or your skill with that item. So if I come here and I look at my skills, because I have skill 18 in daggers, that is why I have 2 damage with, or 1 damage with this dagger. If I were to up the skill, or up my skill in daggers, that minimum damage would increase. So we only care about the maximum damage. So for the wooden dagger, it's 2. For stone dagger, it's 3. For Puck's dagger, it's 3. And for the Crescent dagger, it's 4. So this damage scaling, this distribution between these 4 weapons, not very good. Because we are not letting us use decimal places for values, we can't get a very good distribution, which means that if we look at the curve for this, it's going to look something like this instead of this. And in fact, it actually kind of looks like this, because if you saw Puck's dagger had the same damage as the stone dagger, which is really a shame because, you know, it's a big upgrade, but it's like, well, what's the point of grinding for Puck's dagger if I already have the stone dagger, which does the same thing? It's just a fancy looking upgrade. It just looks nicer, which is, maybe it's enough reason for you, but it's still, you want to use power. And if I have another example pulled up, we can look at the Novice Frost Wand of Frost. Again, another really rare hard weapon to get, but it does 2 damage. It makes up for that because of its speed, because, you know, you can spam the heck out of it. But the thing is that it's hard to balance this because it's 2 damage. This does as much damage as the wooden dagger. And so what they could do is, let's say this weapon is too strong right now, or let's say it's too weak actually. So they want to make it a little stronger. Well, how do they do that? Well, right now it's 2 damage. So if they increase it to 3 damage, well, the problem is now it went from being as strong as a wooden dagger to being as strong as Puck's dagger, which means that, and I'm just talking about in terms of damage, not in terms of power, I guess. But now it might be too strong, whereas 2 is too weak, 3 is too strong. They need this middle ground here. They need to be somewhere in the middle, but they can't get there because it doesn't have enough distribution. There's no room for decimal places, and even if they did use decimal places, that would be ugly and not very fun to work with. So that's the biggest problem. And if you don't know with Swords and Magic, the power distribution for it is 1, 2, and sometimes I've heard them say 20, I've heard them say 30, but I've even heard them say 50. So we'll go with the best case scenario and say 50. So at the very start of the game, the damage distribution, you should be doing around 1 damage, which, you know, makes sense with like the wooden dagger. and at the end of the game you would be getting weapons 50 damage. So a distribution of 49. So what this means is that you're not going to get a very good change in numbers as time goes on. It's very hard to create this curve without using decimal places, because over here you have 1 and over here you have 50. So between like this number and this number, it's hard to get a good change in numbers, and that's why you get things like this, where this stone dagger has the same damage as Puck's dagger. It's hard to tell the difference between the two, and even with like the crescent dagger and Puck's dagger, if I come back here, it's only an increase of 1 damage. 1 damage, that's all it is. Sure, you get a little bit less speed and a little bit more crit, but it's a little like hard to, if you're just looking at the numbers, then all it is just a reskin with a 1 damage increase, which doesn't feel very good. I put a lot of work into getting this crescent dagger. I would expect that it would have more damage than what it does. But again, with this distribution, it's really hard to do. So I want to talk about like some solutions, and obviously this is my opinions. I don't expect anything to come of this. This is just kind of how I would fix it. So I understand, their logic, why they want low numbers. It's because high big numbers are a little too out there, a little too weird and random. It doesn't really make too much sense, so that's why they're keeping with small numbers. But in my opinion, it's not very, I guess, even though it makes more sense, it's not as fun for the player, because I, as the player, if I grind for a big weapon, I want to see big numbers. I like big numbers. It's just how people are. We like to see ourselves grow. We like to be able to compare ourselves with other people and say, look at that. Look how far I've come. I've gone so far as to go from having 1 damage weapons to having 50 damage weapons, whereas now I'm just saying, oh, 1 damage to 10 damage. It doesn't seem like that big of a impact or difference. So what I would do is very simple. I would just, personally, I would say, instead of going from 1 to, let's say 50, I would go from 1 to 500. Even if you just increase it by just 1 decimal place, just multiply it by 10, it's going to make a huge difference in what you can and can't balance. Now, instead of having, that stone dagger which does, 3 damage, and Puck's dagger which does 3 damage, they now go to 30, and that means you can balance it a little better. So I can say, okay, Puck's dagger is 35, while the stone is 30. Now there's a difference, and you can more easily fine tune each weapon. And the biggest issue with the current system is, let's say, let me get a different color here, something that you can maybe see. Can't really see that, but let's just say, because the weapon distribution is 1 to 50 right now, like we said. So let's say there's 100 daggers in the game. Well, that means that there's going to be some overlap with daggers, let's say, or even weapons in general. If I have 200 weapons, then there's going to be a huge overlap in all of these numbers. There's going to have to be multiple weapons with 45 damage, and there's going to have to be multiple weapons with 50 damage, and there's going to be a lot of duplicate numbers, and so you don't really get much variety in weapons, and it's hard to get variety and variance in them because you don't have much distribution. You have a lot of weapons in the game, but not many numbers to play with. So yeah, in my opinion, even just adding 1 0 to the weapon numbers will help a lot. You can even go further than that, but honestly, just that is going to just help allow you to balance games better just by having higher numbers. It helps with balance, it helps with feeling good about the game, and even though big numbers aren't as intuitive for the developer, and I understand where they're going with Swords of Magic and why they want to do it, I do think that bigger numbers end up just working more. That's why that's why games usually use bigger numbers. It's not because they want to, seem crazy or whatever. It's just what feels good. So the next issue I kind of want to talk about is with these stones right here. These Augment Stones that were recently added in I think it was the last patch. But basically, if you don't know how they work, is every weapon has a quality. They can either be flimsy, standard, fine, excellent, or masterwork. And so like this staff right here is standard, but in order to upgrade these, you have to use these Augment Stones. So let's say I have a dagger right here. That's flimsy. So it's a flimsy wooden dagger. If I want to upgrade it to be standard, I just right click this Augment Stone, find the dagger, and then enchant it. And now it's upgraded. And it upgrades the damage. So let's say this flimsy dagger right here. It's 2 damage right now. I want to upgrade this. It's going to upgrade, and now it's 3 damage. So that's basically just how they work. And the same thing will happen with the fine Augment Stones, where if I want to use this, I would select a standard weapon and I would upgrade it. And I believe, as far as I'm aware, and that does look like it's the case, you have to upgrade in order. So I can't upgrade a flimsy weapon into a fine one. It has to go flimsy, then to standard, then to fine. And so that's just how they work. You'll notice I have a excellent spear, and I also have over here a masterwork mallet. That's because those were from before Augment Stones were added, and these were upgraded in different ways. But this is the new system now, so this masterwork mallet and excellent spear would be a lot harder to get now, and I would probably never upgrade them now. So this system seemed like kind of fine at first, but after thinking about it for a bit, honestly, there's 2 big problems with these Augment Stones. The first one is hoarding, which is something I've been doing a lot. As you can see, I have 36 Augment Stones, the standard ones, very easy to get, yet I just don't want to use them. Like, I don't know why, I just don't like going through and using them. And the same thing goes with the fine ones. I have 2 right now, and I haven't used a single one. Since I've played with these Augment Stones, I have not used a fine one because the thing is, I'm worried that I'm going to need it for something else in the future. Like, what if I get a really cool weapon later on in the next quest I do, and then, oh, nope, I use my fine Augment Stones, and now they're a waste. So I just end up not using them, not spending them, and in terms of game design, that's not good. You are taking I am essentially taking out the fun out of myself. As the developer, you want to be pushing players to use your systems, so you want to push them to use these stones. Right now, I'm just hoarding these stones and not using them when, there's a lot of good options. I could use it on this Crescent Dagger, I could use it on this Azurian Greatsword, I could use it on my Bone Reaper. Any of those things would be great, but it's like, well, what if I find the next great weapon and I need this? Even though there's a fairly good chance that I'm going to start, as I play more, running into a lot more of these fine Augment Stones. And that's fine, because I'll just be running more and more, but I'll still be hoarding them a lot, just like I am with these standard ones. So that's the biggest problem, is that you just want to be pushing players to use these stones more, find a way to push them to use them more. The other problem I see in the foreseeable future is kind of their value as time goes on, and their uniqueness. Because right now, sure, if I upgrade a regular weapon to a standard one, it is a fairly good increase, 1 damage. But once I get into the late games, like beyond Azura Island, to Bone Reach, to the Dragonlands, etc., and get those big epic legendary gear, well, these Augment Stones are going to feel a little plain and, not very exciting, I guess. Even if I get a Masterwork one, and they become a common drop, it's going to be like, oh yay, I increased my weapon by some damage, and that's it, just a bit of damage. And so they kind of lose their fun factor over time as you play more and more. These things are just going to get a little stale, a little boring. They're not going to have as much impact to the fun of them in the later stages of the game. So that's another thing, is you need to add a little more variety, because even with just because there's what 5 or 4 of these Augment Stones, the difference between a standard one and a masterwork one isn't very big. They both do the exact same thing. They increase the damage of the weapon. There's no big difference between this and the best Augment Stone. They're the same. They just have a little bit bigger numbers. So they aren't that interesting. It sounds mean, but yeah. So I guess, how can we fix this? So this is totally opinion based, this solution. And so I don't expect it to go through. This is just my idea, just one simple idea that I thought of. I could be wrong about this entire thing. I might be wrong about how people are going to perceive these stones, but this, again, my opinion on this part. It's just, my idea is make it a skill. Just make it so like you have like some skill called an augment skill, similar to jewel crafting or enchanting in World of Warcraft. Something similar to that. And that will push people to have a reason to use these stones more. To say, okay, as you use these stones more and more, you will increase your augment skill. So I will be, entitled, I will feel wanting to collect, flimsy weapons just so I can use these stones to increase my skill level. And then you can say something like, oh, well, I can't use fine augment skill or fine augment stones on weapons until I've got my augment skill up. That will push me to want to use all my standard ones in order to up my skill, so that eventually I can work towards being able to use those masterwork ones. On top of that, you could say things like, oh, well, I want to, maybe if you have a high enough augment skill, you can start crafting them as well. So if I have enough resources, I can maybe make a masterwork augment stone just by being a good augmenter. And then I won't feel like that I need to constantly save that masterwork stone, because I will always know that I have a backup, that I will be able to inevitably get that stone and create a new one. You can do some interesting things with this too. You could like say, oh, if I have enough skills, maybe I can extract the stone back out of the weapon. If it's a masterwork one, I could take it out of the weapon and then put it in another one, with my skill. And that would be a way that I could take that stone and, not feel too bad if I waste it by accident or waste it on a weapon I don't like. I don't know about that last part. Maybe extracting it wouldn't be the best, because then you could just, swap it out constantly to weapon. So maybe not that. But one last thing I would say about augment skill, if that was a thing that I would suggest, is for later weapons that have skills. So for instance, if I have a Sword of Fire and it's meant to do fire damage to enemies, let's say. Well, what you could say is, well, that skill doesn't unlock unless the weapon is at least excellent. So if the weapon is not excellent, so it's flimsy or standard or fine, then it doesn't do the burn damage. But as soon as you upgrade it to the excellent with augmenting, then all of a sudden it unlocks that skill, and then all of a sudden it can burn enemies. And that will kind of fix that part where I said that it's a little too dull, like, there's not a difference between, standard and masterwork, because now there will be a difference. And that difference is that with better weapons, you will be able to apply different abilities to them, and you can only do that if you augment them. And you can do other things with this augment thing too, like maybe you could use Augment Stones to make certain weapons, or use them for other things, but you know, that would just be the start. This is just, again, my opinion, my idea, one way that you could fix it. I'm sure there's plenty of other ways you could deal with trying to get push players to use these stones and making it less linear and less, you know, the same over time. So I got fancy and I pulled up a map of the entire world, tier 1, just to demonstrate this for you guys. So I want to talk about zoning in the game. So if you don't know, right here, this is Azura Island, and then this is the rest of the world. So the way that the game works right now is here in Azura Island, this is the early to mid game content, how this is supposed to be designed. And here you have the farmlands, which is meant to be the late game. And then right now, everything else is meant to be end game. So, you know, you level through Azura Island and farmlands, and once you do that, you are essentially max leveled. And then you're free to explore everything else and grind up, get your best gear that you can, and do everything you can. So I kind of want to talk about, you know, the good things and the bad things about this system, because I struggle a little bit myself thinking about this. Like, is this really that bad of a system? Like, there's good things and bad things about it, so is it that big of a deal? And I came to the conclusion that yeah, it kind of is. So the good things about it, so if this is all your progression right there, and everything else is just end game content, you know, no progression, no getting better, then you have this sense of openness, you know, like I'm free to go any place that I want and nobody can tell me otherwise, because I am able to fight anything at this point. There's nothing is really much stronger than me, because, you know, I am one of the best now. So that can be a good thing, you know. The feeling of openness makes the world feel more bigger, I guess. But the bad things is, well, this might sound harsh, it makes it be like, well, what's the point? And that's a horrible thing as a game designer to have happen to your game. For people to look at it and be like, what's the point of continuing on from here? You know, if you're going to design this entire big section of area, you want players to play those big sections of area and not get bored. And even though there are dedicated people who will play the game and love the game no matter what, and will go through all the content, you are losing a big majority of people and a lot of retention by cutting them off from progression, by saying to them, no, you're not going to get any better. It doesn't matter if you play through just this area or if you beat the entire world, you're going to be the same strength. You're not going to get much better. Sure, you may be able to get slightly better by, you know, finding neat little combos between spells and weapons, but your health is going to be the same. Your damage is going to be relatively the same. It's all going to be about the same. It doesn't matter that you just completed, you know, just the farmlands, or if you completely 100% of the game. That doesn't make you any better. It just means that you took the time out to go do it, but it doesn't make you a better player now. And so yes, you lose that big majority of people who are playing the game because they want to improve. Like, I for one am one of those people. I like to see progress. I like to see myself get better. I'm a person who likes to look at the numbers and, you know, try and get myself really strong and look at the best weapons and the best gear. That's why I love studying things like balancing, because I like to look at what's imbalanced and what is balanced and see, oh, well, this is better than this weapon is better than this weapon, so I'm gonna use this. I like to improve. And so it kind of it feels bad when it's like, okay, I'm going to complete the farmlands, and then from there on there's no going up. There might be a slight up, but not really. And the truth is, yes, you're gonna have dedicated people. They will still play the game for other reasons besides that. For instance, people who want to play the life sim game where they just build a house, make relationships, things like that, they will still play the game. They will not lose anything by this. That's true. They are going to be just as well off either way by just playing it with a life sim in mind. They won't care about the progression or the damage, but they are going to just, find a place to live and do that. And that's fine. But that it doesn't affect them either if you make it like a normal RPG where it's, guided, where it's got progression throughout the whole game. So the next real question is then, well, how do we fix this? Because I agree with the Kindred team that the game should feel more open. It is nice to be able to say, okay, I want to be able to go anywhere I want. But in reality, that's really hard to do with progression. Now you could say, for instance, this whole zone right here is just one big progression zone. It's not really end game. It still follows, that linear curve, but this is one big zone. And that is a possibility. It would be a horrible idea though, because that means that in order for that to work, you need to say the player needs to go bounce back and forth from area to area. For instance, like if I have a quest here, then maybe I have a quest there and I just have to bounce back and forth all the way around, just area to area constantly. And that's how you would make that work, which, that's fine for like individual zones, like in Azura Island. If I'm on Azura Island, it's fine for me to bounce back and forth the island doing quest to quest because it's a small area. And so it works. There's not much travel time. But in a place like this is a huge zone where I don't want to be bouncing back and forth all the time like that, because that would be a lot of travel and that would get very tedious fast. That is why games break up zones into smaller subsections, because that means less travel time. They can make the area spread out and make the quest spread out without making it without breaking up. But then you could say, well, Michael, how about this? What if instead of making you bounce back and forth, you just keep all the quests bouncing within one area, and then when you're ready to progress on, you go on to the next area and you bounce around within this area and do quests there, so that you're not bouncing back and forth all the time. Well, at that point, you've literally just made zones. You'd have one zone here, one zone here, and one zone here, and you're just bouncing back and forth within those zones. So you've literally just gone back to the start where you just have zones. And that's how games came to be how they are, because the reason there are zones is to reduce travel time. That's why they're split up into zones in the first place, is to reduce travel time. It's not because they don't like you feeling open, it's because they don't want you traveling everywhere. It's just a way to divide up zones so that you're doing quests within one centralized area without huge travel times. So how can we make a good enough balance between this whole feeling of openness and travelness and not this feeling of no progression, no getting better? Well, again, this is my opinion. What I think should be done is they should go to a typical zoning solution where they say, okay, you're gonna in general come here, then you're gonna go here, you're gonna go to here next. So divide into zones, 1, 2, 3. But of course, try not to focus on that. Try not to say, okay, you have to go here, then here, then here. Try to make it so that all the areas are connected. For instance, if I have a quest here, then maybe there's another quest here that it would make sense where you go back to here. You go back to zone 2 to complete a quest. Maybe there's a guy in the Bone Reach that he has a brother in the farmlands and you need to go talk to him. That's fine. It won't, create too much travel time. But if you interlock zones or interleave zones like that, and the quests within those zones, you're gonna have a much better time, because that'll help open things up, make things feel better, more open. So you interleave quests. You can also have secrets, like for instance Zone 1, maybe there's a secret there that talks about something that's going to happen in Zone 3. And if you're a smarter player, you'll remember that, and once you get to Zone 3, you'll go check out that thing. And this interleaving of zones will kind of help make the world feel open without making it feel like, oh, everything in Zone 3, which is, Bone Reach, has to be within Zone 3 Bone Reach. So that's basically the best thing you can do, is just interleave the quests like that. The last thing you can do, which is important, is once you beat the game, once you do all the progression, what do you do in endgame? And the solution to that is going backwards, which means that once you reach endgame, the point of endgame is to, like I said, is to tie up loose ends. You want to go back and in endgame and finish up things that you couldn't while you were doing quests, while you were progressing. So for instance, maybe I go back in endgame and I collect all the secret gear. Maybe I go back and min-max my weapons and find better combos with spells and weapons and things like that. Maybe I go back and try life sim. Maybe I go back and talk to more NPCs, finish up some zones, but more importantly, what I think should happen in endgame is make the entire world kind of one big zone. So have dungeons or areas in here inside of Azura Island, inside of Farmland, inside of Bone Reach. Make zones or dungeons within each of these zones, just like mini zone kind of, whether it's a dungeon or like a little section of area that is end game content. So that means within each one of these zones there is a little subsection or a little dungeon or a few scattered just all around. That's all end game content, stuff that you cannot complete unless you have completed everything else, gone through all the progression. So if I'm in Azura Island starting off, then I cannot do this dungeon, whether or not it's because their enemies are too strong, whether or not it's just a dungeon that I can't get to yet, until I am strong enough to do that dungeon or area. That way, once I do end game, I can go back through the entirety of Tier 1 and start doing those little zones, because now I am strong enough. And now I can go back through and I can be like, look how much I've progressed, look how much I've gotten better, to the point where I can now go back through and do these zones. These areas that back when I was a newbie starting out, it looked like I would never get there. A zone where if I went in there, they just one hit me and smacked me down, and now I can go there and I can defeat everything. And this can be the zone, these can be areas where it helps you tie up those loose ends. These are the zones that get you those combo items, that help you finish up your enchanting skills, that help you get those life sim aspects that you've always been wanting. This is how you tie up those loose ends and help the player to complete the goals that they want to complete, whether or not it's getting the most legendary furniture, whether it's finishing up their professions, getting the best gear, things like that. That's what these little zones are for. That's what endgame is for. And so this helps a little bit better than just having this be endgame, because if you just have one big zone right here that is all endgame, it's hard to use that to tie up those loose ends, because that makes the entire zone one big giant loose end that you're trying to complete while also tying up other little loose ends. So this is just one solution that I think would be better than this. I don't agree with it. I don't agree with making everything else in Tier 1 one big end game, but I mean, they're free to do what they want. This is my opinion, and I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully this was a little educational and this helped you guys kind of get some ideas for your games and how kind of balancing works in general in games. There's a lot more I could talk about, especially with game design in general, along with in Swords and Magic. There's a lot I could talk about, but it's a huge video. Sorry to bore you guys, but hopefully you enjoyed.